The Greeks invented monotheism. It systematically went through every ancient Near Eastern law, every biblical law, and every Greek law, compared them to see which one the biblical law came closest to. Now, Plato said, if you're going to create a nation, you want it to last forever and the citizens to be obedient. What you have to do, convince them that their laws were given by a god in ancient times and that they had never been changed from then till now, so that the whole citizenry superstitiously inclined to believe and accept them and never revolt against them. So he said you have to create that illusion any way possible, because Minos of Crete and Lycurgus of Sparta and other Greek lawgivers with the most successful, long-lasting constitutions, they were the ones that said our laws came from Zeus or our laws came from the Oracle of Delphi. You have to convince them that you have this body of divinely inspired law. Ptolemy II Philadelphus contacted the authorities in Jerusalem, and they sent 72 elders a copy of the books of Moses to translate into Greek for the Great Library. The books of Moses being written around 270 BC at the Great Library of Alexandria, using a lot of Greek sources that were found there.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Today I'm joined by Russell Gmirkin, who is a trailblazer in some new ideas concerning the Hebrew Bible. And I would say you've put some pieces together that most people haven't been able to put together, but it makes really good sense. And what I'm speaking about is related to the book that you wrote called Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. And welcome. First of all, welcome for coming on. And for anyone who has no idea what we're talking about, why don't you just give them a little rundown on what this is?
Sure. I've done a lot of research on Greek sources used in the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Jewish Bible or the Old Testament. A lot of people don't realize that the authors of the books of Moses were very well read. They knew Greek literature. They drew on Plato and Berosus and Manetho and all sorts of Greek authors, as my research and that of others has shown in, say, the last 20 years. The implications are pretty amazing in that it means that the books of Moses were written a lot later than people used to imagine. My research has pointed to the books of Moses being written around 270 BC at the Great Library of Alexandria, using a lot of Greek sources that were found there by a team of the same team of Jewish scholars and Samaritan scholars that later legend said came to Alexandria at the invite of King Ptolemy II to translate the books of Moses into Greek. Well, I was able to, in my first book, Berosus and Genesis, was able to narrow the date of the books of Moses to practically exactly the same year that we know the Septuagint was translated.
Wow.
And so that led me to conclude that these were the same people. The people that legends had translated into Greek were the same people who, wrote it 5 minutes earlier or whatever.
Right.
So that's the thrust of my research. And in the book Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, I specifically look into the laws of Moses to show that they came from Greek sources and specifically from a book of Plato's called Plato's Laws. So in a nutshell, that's the research I've been up to in the last 20 years.
So that's fascinating. So let's play this tape through. Okay. So let's talk about this for a second. Alexander the Great. It's the 330s, late 320s BC,
Right.
and he is invading the world. He's leaving Greece. He's going into Egypt. He's going into Syria, Turkey, and he's on his way to Babylon. If he goes into Judea, what does he find there? Does he find a priestly class that has scrolls? What is going on at this time? Compared to what you think?
Well, the best contemporary evidence for the state of Jewish literature around that time is the Elephantine papyri of about 450 to 400 BC. This was a military colony of Jewish and Aramean soldiers in Egypt. They were in correspondence with Jerusalem. They consulted them on religious issues. They consulted them when their temple was burned down by the Egyptians, and they asked Jerusalem for permission to build a new temple of Yahweh. So, which the people in Jerusalem, the high priests and whatever, they gave them permission. So you don't have Deuteronomy, that's for sure. And in fact, in all the Elephantine papyri, there's no reference to Moses, Abraham, David, any biblical figure.
Wow.
There's no reference to Mosaic law. There was a 7-day week, but this one ostrakon, or a broken pottery sherd with writing on it, has this employer tell his employee, you offload those vegetables on Saturday or I'm going to kill you. So they had work on what later became the Sabbath.
Wow.
They had a Passover and Days of Unleavened Bread, but it didn't involve Moses or the Exodus. It was just an agricultural feast. So all of that shows that towards the end of the Persian period, just before Alexander the Great, they didn't have any writings. They didn't have Moses, none of that. So there weren't a bunch of scrolls, 100 years later, 120 years later, at the time that I posit that the books of Moses were written.
Okay. Are you familiar with I think it's called the Stele of Meshe? It's a Moabite rock.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, where does this fit in? Because I believe, if I'm not, I could be wrong. I believe it mentions the House of David on this thing, or maybe he doesn't. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, that would be the Tel Dan inscription.
Okay.
That some people say mention the House of David, Bet David. Although when I inspected that inscription in 1997 in the Israel Museum, I found some indications that maybe it was a forgery.
Wow.
Because the Tel Dan stela is broken, and sometimes the letters appear to go onto the break, and then sometimes, because they were being careful, the letters approach the break but stop short. So you have an incomplete letter that doesn't reach the edge because they're afraid of ruining a great word.
Wow.
So
interesting.
So that's probably mine is probably the best challenge to the authenticity of the Tel Dan inscription. Although I wasn't able to inspect it outside of the plastic shielding, so my conclusions are not definitive. But
Sure.
but the Meshe stela, or the Moabite stela, it's also called. It was I think 700s BC, found in the ancient kingdom of Moab, and it refers to the house of Omri and Israel. And it even refers to the tribe of Gad, which is one of the 12 tribes of Israel, except that it says that Gad was Moabite for as long as anyone could remember. So it doesn't quite match up with the biblical account, but it does verify. It's a contemporary record of Omri, who's one of the kings in the book of
Right.
First Kings, and things like that. Important inscription.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see that. And now, so then with that being said, you got this great library in Alexandria, and this city's built by the Ptolemies, who are the successors of Alexander. There's a lot of wealth, a lot of money put into the city, a lot of knowledge being brought to this city. So how do you get from? My question is this. This is my big question. Hopefully you can answer this. Well, how do you get this philosophy that seems to line up with the Babylonian Hammurabi's eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth
Mhm.
in the Torah section? And then how does that? So if you're Hellenized, if the world's becoming Hellenized, how does the Hebrew Bible go with that rather than go with like the laws that you see from not Minos? Is it Minos? Minos is a lawgiver.
Uh, Minos was a lawgiver on
Yeah,
Crete, I think, or
yeah.
one
Okay,
of
so
those.
that's or maybe
Yeah,
Solon, but I'm thinking
yeah,
of those guys. How do
yeah,
you get those comparisons?
yeah. Well, the book Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, it systematically went through every ancient Near Eastern law, every biblical law, and every Greek law, compared them to see which one the biblical law came closest to. Um, and in a lot of cases, it was Greek law, specifically Athenian law, and a lot of times Plato's laws. But there were also cases where it followed the ancient Near Eastern law codes, the law code of Hammurabi, Middle Assyrian laws, the law of Eshnuna, a sprinkling of different ancient Near Eastern law codes. Um, so you have these old and you have the new. Now, Plato said, when you create in the book Plato's Laws, he said, if you're going to create a nation and you want it to last forever and the citizens to be obedient, what you have to do is you have to convince them that their laws were given by a god in ancient times and that they had never been changed from then till now, so that the whole citizenry will be superstitiously inclined to believe and accept them and never revolt against them. So he said you have to create that illusion any way possible because Minos of Crete and Lycurgus of Sparta and um, other Greek lawgivers with the most successful, long-lasting constitutions, they were the ones that said our laws came from Zeus or our laws came from the Oracle of Delphi or whatever. So he said, you have to convince him that you have this body of divinely inspired laws. And he also said that in order to support that illusion, uh, that you should look into all the local customs, the local temples, the local altars, local priesthoods, and get them all on board and incorporate as much of that old stuff as possible to support the illusion that your new laws that you just introduced in 270 BC actually date to 1400 BC or whatever. Um, so you see a lot of old stuff in the books of Moses as much as they could cram in there. And clear in the Hellenistic era, they still had memories of the law of Hammurabi and some of these ancient Near Eastern law codes. Uh, the people who had that memory were these. In 725, Samaria, the northern kingdom, fell to the Assyrians. And the Assyrians took the ruling class and they carted them off to, Media and whatever places. And then, according to that same policy, a few years later, Babylon rebelled against Assyria. So they took their ruling class and they transported them to Samaria and settled them.
Wow.
Which is recorded in the Book of Kings and elsewhere. So you have this the intellectual elites, the ruling class in Assyria, were these Babylonian kings and priests and scholars and really smart, educated people. And of course, they had all sorts of memories of Babylonian traditions, including Babylonian laws of Hammurabi, all the rest. That Babylonian population, it didn't die out. It didn't disappear. A lot of scholars today act as though it did and that they were assimilated into the local population. Well, ruling classes, they never assimilate. They try and preserve their power, their education, everything special about them, and they persist through time. And with them, these Babylonians preserved all sorts of Babylonian traditions, including legal traditions and others. So and then they became part of the Samaritans, and the Samaritans helped, along with the Jews, they helped write the books of Moses. A lot of recent scholarship says that the Samaritans had the major role in writing the books of Moses.
Wow.
I mean, why do you have 12 tribes of Israel, of which only one is Judah?
Right.
All the rest of them are from Samaria.
Wow.
And Judah has a very minor role. Gerizim, which is where the Samaritan temple was, it's mentioned in Deuteronomy. Ebal, which is another Samaritan site, it's mentioned in Deuteronomy. So there's lots and lots of indicators that the Samaritans really had more to do with writing the books of Moses than the Jews did.
Do you think this plays into the priestly sources versus the Yahweh sources? Is there some sort of is the Sumerians and the Judeans? Is that what that is, or is that just completely unrelated?
Well, Richard Elliott Friedman, he says that the Yahwist is mostly Southern traditions. He associates that with Judea.
Judah, yeah.
Judah, and that the Elohist was a Northern tradition. So those stories probably came from the Northern territories.
Yeah.
And as far as the priestly tradition, everybody, all scholars today pretty much say, well, the priestly tradition, that represents the Jewish temple and the Jewish priesthood and all of that. Why is that? Why not the Samaritan priesthood? Why not the Temple of Gerizim? Why not their traditions? The animals sacrificed in the book of Leviticus, cows and sheep and doves, bones from all of those have been found by archaeologists on Mount Gerizim. So we know that they were doing the same religious laws.
Yeah.
So really the priestly tradition could also be Northern and Samaritan as well. There's no reason to associate it with Jerusalem or the Jews, in my opinion.
Interesting. When you read Josephus, when he talks about the creation of the Septuagint, he mentions that it's Philadelphia, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and they take 70. I think Philo writes about this too. They take 70 Jews and bring them over to Ptolemy, and all of them come up with the same story, the same representation. What do you think this has anything to do with? What do you think this has to do with with your theory? And is this sort of a fabrication of what happened?
Well, it's legend. I mean, it goes back to a document called the Letter of Aristeas, which was written around 150 BC. by a Jewish philosopher named Aristobulus, who was living in Alexandria. And he wrote this story about the Septuagint translation and how Ptolemy II Philadelphus contacted the authorities in Jerusalem, and they sent 72 elders to and a copy of the books of Moses to translate into Greek for the Great Library. So, in my opinion, the 70, which is what the word Septuagint means, it just means 70. This is a reference to the Jewish Senate, which we know from rabbinical sources. Different sources say they had 70 or 71 or 72 members. You know, there were 70 plus the Sagan plus the high priest makes 72 altogether. And the books of Moses wrote this 70-member Senate into the book of Exodus when it had the 70 elders visiting Mount Sinai to receive the laws. So it was kind of a self-reference there, which is kind of cool.
It is cool.
So there weren't, you know, in this letter of Aristeas, these 70 scholars, they translated parts of the books of Moses in pairs, and amazingly, when they compared them, they were word for word identical. You know, a miracle. Philo says that these 70 translators were as inspired as the 70 elders on Mount Sinai, and they had a yearly festival in their honor in Alexandria. The local Jewish community did. But you know, this was legend. These 70 scholars, there probably weren't 70 scholars. First off, we know that there weren't 70 translators of the Septuagint. There were like 2 or 3, because Septuagint scholars can track the vocabularies and they have a very good handle on that. So that's legend. And there probably weren't 70 scholars at Alexandria either, but the Senate, or the 70, they authorized this official expedition to Alexandria. And so they were given the credit for authoring these books of Moses and the translation. The word 70 probably comes off of the manuscript tag of the Septuagint translation itself at the Great Library of Alexandria. There was a gentleman named Callimachus, who was the inventor of library science at Alexandria at that time. And he invented this system where every book was in the library catalog, and it listed the author, the number of lines, where it was written, all of that sort of stuff. So in my opinion, this manuscript tag and the catalog entry claim that the authors of the books of Moses were the 70, you know, the Jewish Senate. And then in later times, since they didn't want to claim authorship, they claimed Moses wrote all of these books. So they demoted themselves to translators. And so in later times, the legend arose how they were the translators of the Hebrew Bible. But so anyway, that's my take on the whole 70 thing.
Wow, that's interesting. So and that's funny because the Senate that's an Athenian tradition itself.
Yes.
So the fact that you have a Senate of 70 Jews, right there, you're off the bat, you're already working within a Hellenized mindset to have that.
Yes.
That is fascinating.
And in fact, in Plato's laws, his Senate or ruling council was called the Nocturnal Council because they met at nighttime, or at least they started before dawn. But it was composed of leading experts in theology and philosophy and ethics and government, the educated elites. including the current and all past high priests of the cult in in the city that or nation state that Plato was talking about. So it was composed of high priests. They were the leaders in Plato's law of this theocratic form of government that he invented, and the new form of Jewish government in the 270s BC that was led by a high priest. That's directly an imitation of Plato's laws.
That's fascinating. So I want to highlight some other aspects that people might be not, because I think what helps your theories, for me at least, was when I started to look at the pre-Socratics of Greece, and I started to figure out that, or I started to learn that this idea of, I don't want to say monotheism. I don't like that term, but the idea of a divine providence that governs all things, or first cause,
Mhm.
that is something that is not new, or not new from Judaism. So a lot of people think that comes from Judaism. No, this was already an idea that was pretty prevalent along the pre-Socratics, going back
Yeah.
to 600 BC. I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to touch on that for a little bit. If you got anything you want to say about that.
Oh, sure. The Greeks invented monotheism. Um, Specifically, the Greek natural philosophers, starting with Thales and Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, Socrates, all of those. They invented a form of monotheism. Um, the Greeks had all sorts of gods running around on Earth and cohabitating with each other and humans and living on Mount Olympus and all these dinky gods. Um, but the Greek philosophers who were trying to come up with an explanation for the whole universe um, came up with these theories of cosmogony, which a lot of people call cosmology, kind of the same thing. Um, a theory of the origin of the universe. And one problem that they worked on was, how did the universe start in motion? Um, Especially since motion is what created the cosmos, in their opinion. Anaxagoras thought that the spinning of the cosmos, or the material, it threw out the stars and the moon and the sun, and he had all of these. He used a lot of physics and observation to figure out how the observable world came into existence. But motion, that was a problem. Uh, but all the Greeks believed that anything that could move itself, propel itself, was alive and had intelligence and soul. They looked at themselves first of all. Uh, Nothing pushes us around. It's our own intellect. We decide to, go get a cup of coffee or whatever. Um, so they attributed the motion of the earliest universe to an intelligence, a divine intelligence, God in some form. At the beginning of the universe, he set things in motion, um, and then the universe evolved from there. So a lot of the natural philosophers said there was a single cosmic intelligence, a divine intelligence, a God who existed at the start of everything. And so it's
Demiurgos. Is that, I'm not mistaken, that's what they called it. Demiurge.
yes, that's what Plato called the demiurge, the craftsman. He was from the eternal realm. He created the cosmos. He was a monotheistic god, basically, at
Right.
that time.
Yeah.
And then in Plato's Timaeus, he said, okay, the demiurge, he created the cosmos. It was perfect. It was wonderful and eternal, because everything that the demiurge creates is necessarily perfect and eternal. Uh, But then there's these pesky humans. They're not eternal. They're not good necessarily. So his demiurge couldn't have created them. So in Timaeus, he said, okay, well, the demiurge, this eternal cosmic monotheistic God, had all sorts of offspring, the sons and daughters of Greek myth. And he said, that's who created mortal life, all these dinky gods running around below. So there was monotheism at the very start, and then that monotheistic God retired from the scene, like the God in Genesis 1. 6 days, that's it, I've had it, I'm retiring. And let the local gods take over. So there's monotheism at the start and polytheism afterwards.
It almost makes you wonder if this Neo-Pythagorean, the monad, splitting into two, becoming a decad, and then that becoming 3, 5, 7, 12, blah, blah, blah. I wonder if there's a mathematical reason for this soul mover, if that has some influence into this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, all that Gnosticism, the Neo-Platonists, and earlier and later, it all ultimately comes from Plato's Timaeus.
Yeah.
And he was really heavy into numbers.
Yeah.
He was also into spheres, as the perfect shape, and geometry, and all sorts of stuff. So a lot of that came from Pythagorean mysticism.
Yeah. And then you have the Tetragrammaton with the Jehovah. We say Jehovah, but that's not really that's not really his name. It's really Yod He Vav He. It's a Tetragrammaton. It's actually a quad. There's 4 letters, and that's what it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be the vowels aren't supposed to be added. We start this later on. So I almost wonder if that's sort of a play on this sort of monotheistic God as number type thing. And then even going back to Hesiod mentions something that's pretty peculiar, where he says, like, in the beginning, chaos ruled.
Right.
And sort of from that is when you get all the, like you said, after that sentence, then you get into all these playful, dinky gods. But like, it all starts from this sort of top, not down.
Yeah. Chaos was in Hesiod. In his theogony, we don't know if chaos was eternal or, but he existed. And then the next 2 gods were heaven and earth, Ouranos and Ge, who were his offspring. And then the rest descended from there. And all these rest of these dinky gods. My latest book, which is called Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Accounts, and I just approved the final proofs and mailed off the index, so it's going to get published in the next month or 2. It goes into Genesis 1 through 3, actually Genesis 1 through 11, to show how it's based on Timaeus. And you have the creator God of Genesis 1 is the same as Plato's demiurge, the eternal cosmic monotheistic God. And then Yahweh, he's one of the dinky gods running around on earth.
Yeah.
He's one of the sons. And God, Genesis 6 talks about the sons of God.
Yeah.
Yahweh was one of them.
Yeah. And it's funny because the idols that you find in Canaan, when archaeology goes and digs up these idols, Yahweh is just one of the bunch of many, all these little gods like Asherah, Yahweh, El. He's just all these bunches. He's just one of many.
Yeah. Deuteronomy 32, I think it is, says that Yahweh is one of the offspring of El Elyon, God the Most High, who was the head of the 70 gods in the Canaanite
70.
pantheon.
You notice that? And it's like they're trying to imitate heaven. There's that what is above, so below mentality of the ancient world, where you sort of you run your Senate the way heaven should be run.
Yeah.
So the senates have 70 members. Heaven has 70 gods.
Yeah.
It sort of lines up. And
It,
by the way, I have to say, when I read Timaeus, the language does very similar to Genesis language.
mhm.
The very the sort of in the beginning it was
Yeah.
it's just very the language sounds very similar.
Yeah. Yeah. Genesis in the beginning. That's the Greek in the Septuagint translation of Genesis 1. And they Septuagint scholars know that the translators of Genesis 1 read Plato's Timaeus because they use some of the same special words and phrases. Uh, so my book is showing, yeah, the translators used Timaeus. So did the authors. Uh, Same group, same translators, same everything. Um, yeah, so you have another thing that's interesting in terms of Hesiod and his theogony, where chaos begot heaven and earth. In Genesis 2, verse 3, uh, you have a statement, the generations of the heaven and earth. Later on in Genesis, you have sections called the generations of Adam, the generations of Noah, the generations of so and so. Each one of them is talking about major figures in the past and their descendants. Well, here you have heaven and earth as who are gods as well as physical entities. Um, Genesis is talking about the book of especially in the Greek, the book of the generations of heaven and earth. It's a theogony, just like in Plato's Timaeus and in Hesiod's theogony.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of Greek, really interesting Greek stuff going on in Genesis, and the Hebrew Bible didn't start out monotheistic; it started out polytheistic. And in Genesis, there's none of the gods are bad either; they're all good guys. It's only in Exodus through Joshua that you get Yahweh saying, uh, "Don't worship anybody but me. I'm a jealous God. The
It is
other gods are wicked and their cults are abominable, and only worship me." Plato said specifically, the gods are not jealous; they all get along.
That is such a good point.
Yeah, yeah. So Exodus kind of overthrew the philosophy you find in Genesis.
Wow. Never thought about that. So, and I want to ask you this: if you're reading, I don't know if you probably read the Greek Alexander romance,
Yeah.
where Alexander he's sort of going through the world, and he's paying attention to the oracle of Amon, but it's no different than an oracle from Zeus or Serapis or Mithra. It's
Yeah.
almost like this concept of divine providence. It's like depending on where he's at, what location of the world he's in, whatever god, whatever oracle he's at, it's all the same god. It's like a monotheistic attitude.
Yeah.
And then he even has his meeting with the Jews where he sort of talks to them and says, "Your God is my God," and blah blah blah. And he sort of just kind of goes through that with that attitude. I almost wonder if I know the sources for the Alexander romance are lost and it's been passed down, and what we have is from like the 1st century BC. But
Right.
it almost makes you wonder if there is something there that goes back to this time period where these books were written. I don't know if you think. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I discussed Alexander Romance a little bit in my earlier book, Brosis and Genesis. It's thought that the earliest version of the Alexander Romance probably was written in Alexandria around the 270s BC. I think by, I have to look it up.
Castellanus.
Not Callimachus, but one of those who was in Alexander's circle and wound up in Alexandria.
Hey, I think it was Castellanus.
Yeah, I could look it up. Well, I'd look it up.
Yeah, I can do it.
Except we're going to have this phenomenon happening. No, we're not. Usually, my book disappears on a green screen.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pseudo Castilthanus.
Yes, pseudo.
Castilthanus. I can't pronounce it.
Right, and he probably drew on
Callisthenes. That's what it is.
pseudo Callisthenes is how I pronounce it.
Okay,
But
yeah,
you
you got
I
it.
don't really speak Greek or Hebrew. I just read it a little bit.
Yeah.
But he probably drew on a guy named Plutarchus, who was one of someone in Alexander's circle and who wound up in Alexandria. So so there's links. It goes back there.
Right. And that's why I'm saying and they use the word amen as in when he's praying and he's giving oracles, and the word amen, I don't know about you, but I've been trying to find where this word comes from, because
Yeah, I don't know. It's a mystery.
It's
I don't
not
think
a
anybody
Hebrew
knows.
word. It's not Hebrew. It's not Greek. It's not. Where does it come from? I mean, what if it is from the god Amon? And here's why I say that. You ready for
Although there's two mems in Amon and only one M in Amen. So
Yeah, but it's a different language though. And plus, when you go from a language that doesn't use vowels like Egyptian and Hebrew, anything could get changed up. You could add O's and E's and A's, and all of a sudden it's changing the word around. But but forget about all that. This is what led me to think that there's in the book from Plutarch called On Isis and Osiris. There's a paragraph in there where he says that the god Amon, when the Egyptians are trying to invoke the hidden, they call on Amon. So Amon is like when you're calling on when you're invoking the invisible spirit, you say Amon. And I'm wondering if this comes from Alexandria.
Well, that theory is I will say it is as good as any I've heard.
Because we really can't tell. It's all guess.
Yeah.
But I will say this though, as far as me guessing this and not being able to prove it, what other source about that word do we have other than Plutarch's On Isis and Osiris? We have nothing else that's even close to trying to understand where that word comes from. So I don't know. I think it's close enough to me that you could at least should be taken seriously. That's what I think. But like you said, who knows? No one knows.
There's intersections of Egyptian traditions and biblical traditions. Some of the proverbs came from Egypt. That's well known, and a couple of the psalms also came from Egypt. So it's conceivable, and there's a few Egyptian names in Genesis and Exodus. So, and it was written in Alexandria, so there could have been some input from some of the locals.
Yeah. And there's another passage in the Greek Alexander Romance that talks about it sort of describes this sort of society where like iron workers and stonemasons and painters, they would all get together and they would trade amongst themselves, and sort of describes this sort of like what we would now call a Masonic order, but like not Masonic, but whatever it was called back then. And it just sounds like there was whatever was happening in Alexandria at that time period was this cultural mashing of ideas, which gave us all these religions, all these philosophies. I'm even willing to say that there's sort of a proto-Christianity evolving from this.
Well, that's a theory that's been put forward, and it's usually formulated like this. A scholar named Michael Lockwood he had argued that, okay, in India, they had Buddhism. And there was king, I think his name was Asoka, something like that.
Ashoka, yep.
And he, it's in one of his stela or inscriptions, he sent out a delegation to the Mediterranean world, and they went to all the major cities, including Alexandria. So you have Buddhists in missionaries, basically, in Alexandria in the 270s BC. Around the same time as the Torah, maybe a little bit later.
Wow.
And we know that in the kingdom of Marawe, I don't know how it's pronounced, which is up the Nile, there's Buddhist statuary that comes from that general period.
Right.
And there's traditions, there were Buddhists in Egypt.
Right.
So then Lockwood and others have suggested that Philo describes a group called the Therapeutes who were living in Alexandria. They had a kind of a communal existence. He called them pacifists, but I'm not sure if that's true or not. And anyway, there's a lot of features of the Therapeutes that are reminiscent of Buddhism. And there's theories that then in turn influenced Christianity, that some of the early Christians came from Egypt. So, there could have been some pathways for all of this cultural intermixing and influences on a large scale. It's conceivable.
And then
Lockwood freaked out when he read my book, Process and Genesis, and found out my discussion of the Jews in Alexandria at virtually the same time. So,
and that's amazing. And when you factor that into the volumes of writings from Philo, so Philo has all these ideas floating around about God being a Trinity, God being of nature of three, the Logos being the divine heir of all things. Like, what? That sounds like Christianity right there.
Yeah, for sure.
Then you factor in when the first century comes around, right before the time of Jesus, so the first century BC, you get the school of Hillel, which the founder of that school, his name is Hillel. He's quoted of being asked, "What is the whole Torah?" And he tells the person to treat people the way you want to be treated. That is the whole Torah. So you already have that influence of Judaism happening. Plus, when you factor in the rabbinic Judaism,
where have I heard that before?
Right. And then go fast forward a century later, where past the temple being destroyed, you get this new sort of rabbinic Judaism, where it's like it's based on the Talmud, where it's back and forth dialogue. What does the back and forth dialogue sound like? That sounds like Platonic.
It's been argued that that's dialectic, and that these are fictional conversations between rabbis of the past, just like Plato wrote these fictional conversations between Socrates and different people back then.
And the profound thing about the Talmud is when you read these dialogues, you're reading something that has an esoteric philosophy baked inside of it. It's not just a mundane conversation. It's a profound conversation that has to do with some sort of teaching within it. And a lot of it's very deeply esoteric, secretive stuff, which is what the Platonic dialogues are trying to do. So you can see the influence between the Platonists and the Jews happening even after the Torah, even after the Old Testament, into the age of the New Testament. And to me, Christianity, it seems like it's like another layer of what already happened, if that makes sense.
Sure, and well, certainly the Christian ideas of heaven and hell, purgatory, all of those come right out of Plato.
Kingdom of Uranus, that's the kingdom of heaven, just like in Plato.
Yeah. And, he postulated this divine realm that was beyond the material realm, where the gods resided and where humans could hope to reside if they were philosophers and perfect and virtuous. That's heaven. And then he talked about the underworld and Tartaros and the people who were uh, wicked but redeemable. They'd just be tormented for 1,000 years and then they get another chance. But some people were so bad they would just reside in Hades or Tartarus forever. This is all straight up Christian doctrine. I mean, they get it all from Plato. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. A little tiny bit of it is in the books of Enoch. But yeah, no, Plato, he cast a long shadow.
The last thing I want to touch on before we close out is what are some of the other, you got I think his name is Thales. How do you say it? Thales. He was if I'm not mistaken, he was a monotheist. Or if he wasn't, he was very close that he talked about God coming from one.
Yeah, possibly. There were a few of them who were monotheistic, pretty explicitly so. Let's see. I think it was who was it? Well, yeah, a number of the Greek philosophers were basically monotheists. Several of them were tried as atheists.
Oh yeah,
because they believed in one God, and that's atheism if you don't believe in the whole polytheistic pantheon.
That's actually a really good point, because Socrates, his charges for when he was killed, when he was executed, was not only atheism but for importing. How can you be both an atheist and two, importing foreign gods? What does that sound? That doesn't make sense. So what I think really happened was he wasn't really an atheist. I think he was sort of subscribing to the Platonic, or what we would call the Jewish gods, or the Jewish God was what he was believing in, which is probably what happened. Because if he wasn't believing in Zeus and Poseidon, literally, like I like to point to the Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, where he has the dialogue between the Epicureans and the literalists, who think that literally Poseidon's in the water right now. Well, Socrates probably was more of he probably thought of these gods as not being literal, but as like allegorical and symbolic for the one true God or the one true divinity. So that could be why he got put on trial.
Certainly, the Stoics believed exactly as you said. They, it's a big problem among the philosophers. How do you investigate this cosmic, eternal God and not get charged for atheism? Like Anaxagoras, he had to flee Athens into exile, or else he would have been executed. Socrates, one of the things against him was that he was a fan of Anaxagoras, and so, but Socrates chose not to leave Athens and drink hemlock instead. But he claimed that he worshipped Apollo and all the regular gods, and he had no problem with any of them. He did believe in the supreme intelligence, and he also claimed individual inspiration from his genius, which was a spirit or voice that would talk to him occasionally and warn him of things.
Yeah.
Sometimes he'd just kind of go into a trance, according to some reports.
Wow.
And so he may have been schizophrenic. He may have had auditory hallucinations. That's one theory. So, what they said, that his genius, his personal angel guide, as you were, that this was a new god, and therefore you can't introduce new gods to Athens, and therefore you have to drink hemlock.
Wow. Yeah. Xenophone is his quote, is a quote from him saying that one God greatest among gods and humans,
Yes.
like mortals, neither in form nor in thought.
Yeah.
He called it a first mover, like thought, like Thales from of Miletus,
Yeah.
which is so. Yeah, these are ideas that are ancient, and they're not just from the Near East. They're from the Hellenized world.
Yeah, they're not at all from the Near East. The Greeks invented monotheism, um, and this cosmic, perfect God. It was introduced to the Jews via Genesis 1, which was based on Timaeus. So really, they got that whole idea from Plato. But the Bible as a whole, the Hebrew Bible as a whole, is not monotheistic. It it favors monolatry, worship of one God, but
Sure.
but it acknowledges the existence of all the other gods. It's just they were all terrible.
Yeah.
Um,
Is Saturn have anything to do with the Sabbath, the god Saturn?
well, yeah. I mean, the Romans had they named the seventh day of the week
Yeah.
Saturn. That's only documented like 100 BC, though. So,
Well, I
uh,
know that Saturnalia is pretty ancient, and he was
yeah,
like the most. It was the most important holiday. It was a 7-day festival in the late December.
yeah,
So I don't know if maybe it had something to do with the Saturnalia and or the Sabbath, where they sort of rest in this time. But that's sort of a yearly thing. But I wonder
yeah.
if there's some sort of connection there.
Well, I don't think there's a direct connection with the Sabbath, and I'll explain why. First off, let me just comment that you have this 7-day week, which surfaces here and there. I think mostly because there were 7 planets. There's the sun, moon, and 5 wandering stars that were visible in the sky. So it was common to have, recognize 7 divinities ruling the sky, and I think the week had to do a lot with that. But in in the Middle East, in Assyria and Babylonia, they had a type of document called a hemerology, which was a list of lucky and unlucky days in the month. They'd go 1 through 30 or 1 through 31 and say, better not do this on such and such a day. It's okay to on this other day, though. And in one of them, the 7th day, 14th day, 21st, 28th day of each month had certain things that a king was not supposed to do because it was very unlucky, such as light a fire, travel, a lot of the same things that you see in the laws of Moses related to the Sabbath. So it really comes from these the 7-day week and the seventh day as a Sabbath is really a simplified version of uh, Mesopotamian hemerology. And probably those, those scholars I was talking to you about in Samaria, uh, they did a lot of calendar stuff, and they probably invented the Sabbath
Interesting.
uh, out of Mesopotamian science.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, there's a lot that we can go into in this. Just anything you want to close up on that you think that we didn't touch on that just real quick before we close out. Anything else you want to say?
Um, well, just I think it's great that you're advocating research and interesting ideas and investigating things. It's always good to look at all sorts of new ideas. Um, it's important to not only be creative but to have critical thinking skills where you invite all these interesting new ideas, but then you really scrutinize them and fact check them like crazy. Um, but yeah, critical thinking skills and creativity, that's something that all of us need to develop, and it's a good thing. That's how we grow as people.
That's a great point. It's a great thing to end on. And I do want to say this though: you do have a book coming out within the next month or two. So I don't know when someone's watching this, week from now, 2 weeks from now. Just be on the lookout. It'll be on Amazon if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, it'll be from, you can probably get it just about anywhere. It'll be from Routledge Academic Press.
Okay. And the title
And
is?
Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Accounts, Cosmic Monotheism and Terrestrial Polytheism in the Primordial History.
Wow, that's the title right there.
That's the title.
That's a great title. And yeah, just everyone watching this, just make sure you're on the lookout for that. That's a must buy. And Russell Gmirkin, thank you for coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.